All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. We're really excited today to be taking a virtual field trip. Always fun when we get to take students outside of the classroom, never having to leave their seats. And today is going to be a good one. So we're taking a little trip to Ocean Wise at the Vancouver Aquarium to learn more about nature's jungle gym, the coral reefs. So the health of the ocean depends on its foundation, and coral reefs are one of the most important and most threatened parts of our ocean. So we're really excited today to have the opportunity to dive in today with Rachel Bell Irving. Rachel, I'm going to turn your microphone on now. We've got a great group of classrooms joining us from across North America. I can see our YouTube audience is growing quickly. So shout out to those classrooms. Make sure you use the chat sidebar on the right. Introduce yourselves. Let us know where you're watching from. Of course, send in some questions. And we'll be happy to work some of those in. Anyways, Rachel, it's so great to have you joining us today. I can see you've got lots of groupies hanging out behind you, and we're really excited for today's event.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's fantastic to meet you. As Joe said, my name is Rachel, and I work for Ocean Wise. Ocean Wise is a conservation organization that is working towards a future where the oceans are healthy and flourishing. And we do this through education, research, and conservation. So lots of different ways that we work with the ocean, that we work with people just like you. And one of those best things that we can do all together is storytelling and talking about the amazing, wonderful world that the ocean is, because it covers 71% of the planet. So 3/4 of a pie, pretty much. And yet we've only really mapped out about 10% of it. So there are lots of mysteries still to had in the ocean and lots of amazing things to discover. And so I'm going to share a little bit with you about some of my favorite animals, which are oftentimes forgotten about, or people don't actually know that they're animals at all. So as Joe mentioned, if you have any questions, we'll definitely save lots of time for that at the end. If you're curious about coral reefs or the oceans or the aquarium or myself, I'm happy to answer any questions. But I also will have some questions for you throughout my little chat here. And so when we go to the classrooms, raise your hand. We'll ask the teachers to sort of field those, and we will get going. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is what are corals, why they matter. And I'm actually going to start off by talking about an entirely different animal, and that is jellyfish. So can I get a little wave if you've heard of jellyfish before? Ooh, excellent. Lots of waves. So Joe, I'd actually like your help if we could go to each of the classrooms and find out one thing that they know about jellies.
All right, let's do it. Let's start with Mr. Martel's class. What's one thing you guys know about jellies?
Emmy, you want to put
Damn it. Let's go, dummy.
I know that jellyfish are mostly made out of water.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you. That's an important one. They're 97% water, in fact.
All right, good one. Mr. Warcott's class, your microphone is on. Who's got a jelly fact?
Quick, Eli, quick. He's coming.
All right.
Right up close so they can see it right there. Perfect. Okay.
That jellyfish sting people?
Hey, that is one of their most famous ones. Awesome.
All right, Mrs. Huggs' class, what you got?
That jellyfishes don't have brains at all.
Yeah, they don't have brains. I love that fact.
All right, Mrs. Bergeron's group.
They sting a lot of people and fish too.
Ah, excellent. They can sting anything that they touch. That's important to note.
All right, and one more, Mrs. Rosnell's group.
They don't have bones.
Stand up.
They don't have bones.
They don't have bones. Excellent. Thank you very much. Yes. So those are some fantastic facts to get us started. Jellies are invertebrates, meaning they have no bones. They're mostly water. There's no brain or heart, and they do have those excellent stinging tentacles. So the reason that we talk about jellies to start with is because corals and jellies are actually related to each other. And so by looking at jellies, we can start to identify what we need to look for in a coral as well. So when I look at jellies, I like to look at their body shape as well. Not only are they mostly that water, and they've also got those tentacles that sting, but they also have that circular shape. We call it radial symmetry. And that's a really important feature because every animal within their family also has to have that feature. They have to be circular or have that radial symmetry, and they have to have those stinging tentacles. And when an invertebrate has those two things, we know that it's we know that it's a cnidarian. That's the group of these animals. So now after we looked at jellies and we look onto corals, we can actually try and figure out how corals and jellies are related. So when we look at this picture, throw up your fingers. How many corals do you think are in this picture? Throw up some fingers here. Okay, lots of everyone's just like, ah, yeah, there's a lot of corals going on. And that's because there are different sizes with corals. That's excellent, fantastic, thank you everybody. So when we talk about corals, we're talking about that big structure. So for example, your entire school would be a coral reef. Your classroom would be a coral, but each one of you is also a part of that, and you are all polyps. So when we go even closer into corals, we see that they're actually a colony of these individual little animals called polyps. So every single one of you would be a polyp. Together you make a coral, and your whole building would be a coral reef. And when we get even closer to them, on a microscopic level, we can start to see maybe some similarities between these ones and jellies. So Joe, I'd like to go back again to the classes and see what similarities do you see between these little polyps and the jellies?
All right, let's go reverse order this time. Let's start with Mrs. Roseno's group. What similarities do you see? Do you see one? No, I didn't catch that one. I saw someone stand up. Can you be a little louder for us? Okay, I heard stinging tentacles.
Excellent. All right, so we do see tentacles. That's great. Maybe we can add to that or have something different from another group.
All right, Mrs. Bergeron's group, your microphone is on.
That I noticed that they have a little round thing inside the tentacles.
Hey, interesting. Yeah, they do have a little circular point right in the center. Good eyes.
All right, so let's jump into Mrs. Hugg's class, see if they see, oops, wrong mic. Let's try that again. There it is. All right, Ms. Hugg's group.
They both wiggle?
Yeah, they wiggle. That's one way that we know they don't have bones.
All right, Mr. Warkosh's group, your microphone's on.
Yep, there you go. Okay, talk.
That they have the little arms on them.
Yeah, they do have their little arms, and you can even see little kind of things coming off of their arms.
One more stop, Mr. Martell's class.
They both look like they both have tentacles.
Nice, excellent. We do call them tentacles. Fantastic. So yes, because scientists have taken a little bit deeper look at what these animals are, we actually realize that they are animals. Many times when we look at a coral reef as a whole, they look more like rocks or plants, but in truth, all of these things are living animals. And that's a very important part to remember, is that as living animals, they have challenges and risks and things like that that they have to deal with in order to survive in their given environment. And one of those cool adaptations that we already mentioned is the fact that they can sting. Now, all jellyfish and all corals can sting. However, we're lucky as people that we aren't always going to feel that sting, because maybe it's a weak jelly or a weak coral, or maybe because our skin is too strong to deal with. So when you go into tropical waters, for example, there are different types of corals that can sting you. Cold water, not so much. And there are cold water corals that we'll talk about in a second. But let's look at what's actually happening when corals are stinging. It's not their most important job. Most corals will actually get their food from photosynthesis, from taking the energy from the sun. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second, but I'm just gonna also pause because this is cool. I love when that happens. So with corals, about 20% of the food they get can be taken from the environment, but they can also use those stinging abilities to protect themselves. Because remember, they're tiny and easily stepped on. So they have to have a way of protecting themselves. And this is a diagram of what is actually happening when a coral is stinging you. And it's because inside of those tentacles are special little cells that we call cnidocytes. There we go. It's in the bottom right-hand corner. And that's what gives them their family name. And inside of those cnidocytes, inside of their cells, are those tiny little harpoons. So when the cell is triggered, or when you touch a tentacle, that little harpoon is released. And that's what causes the stinging sensation. So if you're a little fish, this is a fantastic way to catch your food. So looking a little bit into that microscopic level of what it means to be a coral or to be a jelly, and how you can protect yourself or how you can get your food. Now, corals, as we already mentioned, build up these giant reefs. And that's because they basically are able to build their own home. Has anyone ever used chalk before? Give me a little wave if you've used chalk. Excellent, great. So if you've used chalk, you've actually used the same thing that these animals use to build up their homes. So a little tiny polyp will use what's called calcium carbonate, kind of the same thing as chalk, and they'll build layers and layers and layers around themselves and below themselves to build up basically like these jungle gyms or these castles. And we see the same thing in cold water habitats as well. So corals are not only in warm water, but they're also in cold water as well. So what you're looking at right now are some cold water corals that have done the same thing. They're little polyps that have built up their giant skeletal structure out of chalk, which is pretty cool. It's a useful skill. Now, because they build these great structures, they often form the foundation of an ecosystem. So they are the bottom of that food chain, building up the ocean floor. And what exactly does that do for a coral reef ecosystem? That's my next question for you. And Joe, we're gonna go to the classes again. What job do corals play for their home? Why are they important?
All right, I have a feeling we'll get some good answers here. We're going to mix it up. Let's start with Mrs. Huggs' class. Why do you think corals are important?
That they have a habitat for fish.
Habitat for fish. That is one of the most important ones. Awesome.
Very good one. Mrs. Bergeron's class. What do you guys think? Why are they important?
Because they give ocean food.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of different animals eat corals, or the food that we eat hides in the corals. That's important.
All right, Mr. Martell's group, what do you guys think?
Fish hide in corals like from sharks.
Yeah, hiding from predators is important, especially if you're a baby fish and you want to grow big enough to be eaten by other things.
All right, Mrs. Rosnell's group.
They help to keep the animals safe and warm and have lots of food and nutrients.
Awesome, I like that. So food, warmth, nutrients, shelter, they're building a home for other creatures, which is big. And one more, I think?
One more stop, I believe. Mr. Warkoch's group, your microphone's on.
Because they're going to protect the fish.
Excellent, that's fantastic. All right, so we've got a lot of protection, which is very important. And that's especially useful for baby fish that will eventually grow up to go out into the open ocean. But it's not just for the prey animals, it's also for those animals that need to find food. So sharks, for example, will live in coral reefs because they have to eat too. And this is one of my favorite sharks personally. I'll give you a few seconds and raise your hand once you think you can see the shark. And if your friend can't see the shark, can you help them see the shark? Excellent. All right, I think my mouse will be somewhere. There you go. All right, so if you see there's a few little squiggles kind of along the bottom on the sand, that is actually the mouth of the Wobbegong shark, which frankly is a very cool name for a shark. It's the Tasseled Wobbegong shark. And this shark, because it has those special face, looks a lot like the coral. So this specific fish has actually evolved to look exactly like its home so that it can camouflage and ambush its prey. So corals are important for many different reasons, not only for those little tiny fish that have to hide, but also for the bigger predators that have to find their food. They give a home for all these different animals, and they also provide oxygen for the environment. So at the beginning, I mentioned that corals, about 20% of the food they eat will come from what they catch, but most of the food actually comes from this creature here. So it's pronounced Zooxanthellae. So you can try it with me. Ready? Zooxanthellae. That's a very big word. I love hearing everyone trying. So Zooxanthellae is a special type of algae that lives inside the bodies of the polyps. So imagine if you were a coral polyp and you had a pocket. If you have a pocket on your body, imagine that your little friend, your little algae, was living inside of there. And throughout the day, they handed you snacks. Thumbs up if you'd like that. Yeah, that would be pretty sweet. So Zooxanthellae have a very important job to do because they work with the polyps. They give the corals their food, but at the same time, they get a special place to hide. And so by doing the photosynthesis, they produce oxygen for the environment around them. They're also giving food to the corals. And it's a really great relationship that these animals have. However, the ocean is a pretty stressful place right now. And that's because it's changing at a very rapid rate. So particularly due to climate change is what we're most worried about, because climate change is warming the oceans at a rate that's too fast for the animals to keep up with naturally. And if the ocean gets too warm, even just by 1 to 2 degrees, those zooxanthellae can get really stressed out and they can actually leave their corals, which leaves them without food. So I have a picture of that as well, just to kind of explain it a little bit more clearly. So when you get an increase in temperature, or you can get other things like chemicals in the water, it can stress out the algae, which makes them leave the coral. And that's why we get coral bleaching. Corals, when they're bleached, have lost their color because they've lost their photosynthesizing friends. Now, a coral that's bleached is not necessarily dead, which is important. They can come back. But with this massive die-offs that we're seeing in many different parts of the ocean, and lots of parts of the ocean that we don't even know anything about to begin with, there's a lot of concerns that come into play with this. So going around again, what do you think might happen if we lose corals? What are some of the risks that are involved with that?
Great question. So let's get started. Let's go to Mrs. Bergeron's class first. What do you think is going to happen if we lose coral?
What do you think will happen? Go ahead.
That the reefs will have to find another fish that feels safer with the
Yeah, if we lose the reefs, then those fish won't have a place to feel safe. Awesome. Let's go to another class.
All right, Mrs. Hugg's class, your microphone's on.
So if we lose coral, some fish won't get food.
Yeah, they might not get their food at all. That's an important part of that too.
Mr. Warkosh's group, your microphone's on.
Closer so I can hear you.
most of the fish will die.
Yeah, they could die because they could be eaten by predators or have nowhere to hide or no food.
Mrs. Roseno's group.
Fishes don't have homes.
Yeah, they lose their home. That's definitely a dangerous thing.
And one more, we need to go to Mr. Martel's class. Your microphone is on.
They won't have a place to hide from prey.
Yeah, I like your specifics. So they won't have a place to hide from predators. Those are awesome examples. And I'm really glad that all of you are thinking about the animals, but we can also think about people as well, because there are loads of places around the world that are near corals that rely on them for jobs. So for example, you might be a tour guide that actually takes people out to see the corals. And that's a part of how you live your life. Or you might be a fisherman and you're looking for those fish that hide in the corals or their adult counterparts. So people can be just as affected by the loss of these animals as the ocean can be, because we're all interconnected. For example, over half the air you breathe comes from the ocean. So if you take a deep breath, whew, that feels good. Half of that oxygen came from the ocean just now, no matter where you live. So if we lose photosynthetic things like the algae and their corals, then we start to lose sources of oxygen that are really important for our survival. Now, the nice thing about knowing there's a problem is that we can find solutions, and the solution is going to look different for all of you. One thing that I recommend trying is take a look at the sunscreen that you use and see if it has oxybenzone in it. And you can Google this as well later on. Is Coral Safe sunscreen doesn't have certain chemicals in it, which means it's not going to stress out the algae. So when you go swimming, whether it's in your local waterway or maybe you go on vacation, those chemicals are not going to get into the environment and hurt the corals. And already you're just protecting the water that you have next to you as well. That's one tiny little example of something very simple that all of us can do, is get Coral Safe sunscreen. But I'm sure there's lots of other ideas that you might have on how we can help protect the oceans, whether that's corals or whether that's your local waterway as well. And I'd love to hear them if you have some examples or things you're already doing to help water and help the animals that live there.
All right, let's start off with Mr. Warkoch's group first. What are some things we can do to help protect the oceans, to help protect coral?
By not putting trash in.
Okay, say it louder.
By not putting trash into the ocean.
Nice. So being aware of our trash is a really good way that we can help. Nice.
Really good one. Mr. Martel's group, your microphone's on.
So what are we doing?
Yeah, we gotcha. You're on.
Oh, maybe we can cut back fishing a little bit.
Oh, okay, interesting. I like that idea. Cutting back fishing, or even more specifically, be careful where you get your seafood from. So if you choose a sustainable seafood source, that way you are actively eating a good type of fish and you are showing the fishermen what kind of fish you want. So that's a really good one, is if you are gonna buy seafood, just make sure it's sustainable.
All right, Mrs. Rosino's group, your microphone is on.
Oh, I'm sorry. I only caught a few of that and it sounded really good. Do you mind coming closer to the camera?
Don't.
All right, so he's suggesting maybe stop eating fish because, we only have a certain amount in the ocean.
I think that's really good to be responsible with what you are taking from the ocean. That's awesome.
All right, Mrs. Bergeron's class and then Mrs. Hug's class.
You can clean up all the waste.
That's also good. So we want to be careful of what we're putting into the environment, but if we can also that is great too.
And, oops, that's the wrong mic. Let's try that again. Mrs. Hug's class.
Emergency.
Don't use
Emergency.
too much plastic. Wrong way. Yeah.
Reducing how much plastic we're using is fantastic, because plastic is definitely a risk to corals as well. Those are some fantastic solutions. I'm really happy to hear that you already have these things on your mind. And I challenge you to go out and start using them and enacting them as soon as you leave school today. Tell someone about what you've learned and see how you can apply one of those ideas to your own life as well. And so we've got lots of time for questions. I'd love to know what you'd like to know. If you're curious about anything with its oceans, coral reefs, the aquarium, conservation, happy to help.
All right, excellent. So I'm going to start by giving a shout out to some of the YouTube classrooms who are tuning in. We've got Mrs. Siderman's class from Coburg, looks like some 2nd and 3rd graders. Mr. Dunlop and Mrs. Sanders, 7th and 8th graders from Belleville. What else? We've got some 2nd graders in Milton, Ontario. Mrs. Williams-Egers. We've got Queen Elizabeth School in Belleville, Ontario with Mrs. Boys. We've got a group in Peru and Chile joining us today, which is pretty cool. Miss Pitt's grade 5 class is joining us. All right, lots of cool classrooms joining us. And I'm going to steal a question from online right now. Let's start off with jellyfish. So Miss McLean's group is wondering roughly how long can a jellyfish live? And Miss Pitt's class is wondering about jellyfish having eyes. So a double jellyfish question.
Both very good questions. The short answer is we're not 100% sure on how long jellies can live. In theory, if nothing hurts them, they can live to be decades old. So they're the oldest living sea anemone, which is the jelly's cousin, was over 100. So it's definitely possible for an invertebrate to live a really long time, but only if all the conditions are perfect. In terms of eyes, they don't have eyes like we do, but they do have eye spots, and that helps them detect light and dark. So everybody can try this. If you find a light and look up at a light and then close your eyes, and you take your hand and you wave your hand across your face, you should see a shadow from your hand. And that is how jellyfish are able to see.
All right, very cool. Let's go to a live classroom now. Let's start off. Let's go to Stafford Springs, Connecticut. Mrs. Erickson and Mrs. Bergeron have a group hanging out. Let's get that mic on. There it is. How are we doing, Connecticut?
Hi. All right, what's your question?
Is there any like whales or more animals in the coral reefs
That live near the coral reef?
yes.
Yes. Are there whales or things like that that live near the coral reefs? Absolutely. There are quite a few tropical species of whales as well as dolphins and porpoises. And the fish that they eat will oftentimes live, or their babies will live in the corals. So they are related to the corals. And we also do get some tropical species of fur seals that might interact with those areas as well. And birds. Birds are very important to remember.
All right, good question to start us off. Let's go to Guelph, Ontario. Fifth graders hanging out with Mrs. Hug. Let's get that microphone on. How we doing, Guelph?
Can we ask 2 questions?
Go for it.
What would happen if whenever people went on vacation, they took some coral from the ocean?
Ooh, yeah, that is a good question. And unfortunately, that's actually what people used to do. So there was a whole part of the tourism industry that was cutting off corals, allowing them to dry out, and then selling them as gifts. And that's incredibly dangerous because corals, they break in a second, but they take hundreds and hundreds of years to grow. So doing that can be a really negative impact on the ability for the corals to grow and to live, and can be very damaging for the ecosystem as a whole.
All right, and what's the second one?
The turtle that kept on swimming past, what kind of turtle is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is Skuna, and Skuna is a green sea turtle. She would originally be from Florida or Mexico kind of area, but she was found in northern British Columbia, and she was incredibly sick. So she was actually rescued by our marine mammal rescue team and rehabilitated. And after that process happens, the government is the one who decides whether an animal can go back into the wild or not. And she was decided to be non-releasable because of how injured she was from getting stranded. So she is a permanent resident here, and green sea turtle, she's quite sassy. She's a fun turtle.
All right, fair enough. I don't think I've ever heard a turtle described as sassy, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, she's definitely queen of the habitat.
All right, fourth graders, Barrie, Ontario. Mrs. Rosnell's group. Let me get that microphone turned on. How we doing, Barrie?
If regular coral stings, we can keep a fire coral.
Oh, okay. Joe, did you hear that fully? I heard parts of it.
I think, were you asking if it stings? Is it a fire coral?
No, like if coral stings, what's the difference between fire coral?
Oh, okay. So I think he's saying, well, if all coral can sting, why is there a fire coral? What's the difference?
Ah, okay. Is that correct? Okay, that's a very cool question. The reason that fire coral got its name is because when it stings, it feels like a major burn. But all corals can sting, just some sting worse than others. So fire coral, because it hurts so much, and I have a friend who's been stung, it's not fun. That's why I got its name. So sometimes scientists name them based on how painful it is.
All right, so avoid that fire coral.
Yeah, it's very pretty, but it's very painful.
All right, let's see if we can grab another question from YouTube. Let's see. Okay, so we've got Mrs. Couch is wondering about what it is. Her class is wondering what it is about what coral reef is eating in the water. What is it eating?
Oh, that's a great question. So again, most of the corals are going to eat the energy that the Zooxanthellae gives them from photosynthesis, but they can also eat little microscopic animals that float around in the water. Things like krill is very common, and krill are microscopic little shrimp that float around in the water. So they'll eat tiny particles like that.
All right, good question. Let's see, we need to go to a little closer to you, Rachel, West Kelowna, British Columbia, some second and third graders with Mr. Warcott. Let me get that microphone turned on. How we doing, Kelowna?
Okay, we have 2 questions.
Go for it.
Go ahead, Nathan.
How do the animals breathe underwater?
Ooh, fun question. How do animals breathe underwater? That's a good question. So humans on land, we have a special organ called lungs that you can feel when you suck in air. You feel your lungs working, and that's because oxygen is in the air, and that's what we need in order to breathe. So the lungs are designed to pull oxygen out of the air. When you're underwater, you need something that can pull oxygen from the water. So most of these animals have gills, and gills are sort of like a pasta strainer in a way, where water goes through and the oxygen gets stuck. And that's what they have instead of lungs. I hope that helped answer the question.
All right, question 2.
Are coral on the endangered list?
Yes, they are on the endangered list. I'm not sure where on the endangered list, but it depends on the location. And unfortunately, there are lots of little reefs that we haven't studied, or maybe we haven't found. So they are endangered, but we don't really have all of the information yet either, which is kind of scary.
All right, Mr. Martel's group joining us in Ontario. Looks like some 4th, 5th graders. Let's get that mic turned on. How we doing, boys and girls?
Good. How about you? How does coral get its color?
How does coral get its color? That's a great question. It's from the Zooxanthellae. So when you create photosynthesis, just like flowers do on land, we tend to get very colorful flowers because they're doing photosynthesis, turning sunlight into energy. So the Zooxanthellae are also what gives the coral its color through that photosynthesis process.
All right, jumping back to YouTube, we've got a few more questions have come in. Mrs. Kreiderman's group from Coburg, they're wondering, let's see, lots of good questions, but let's go with this one. Can coral regenerate if it's wrecked or broken?
Very good question. Yes, coral can regenerate if it is broken or crushed. We have around the world a couple different organizations that are working on coral farming. So basically they'll take a little piece of coral and they'll tie it to a rock or a twig or a fence or something underwater, and they'll let it go. It's given it a place to sit, and then it can grow. It just takes a really, really long time, hundreds of years for coral to grow. And that can be why it's hard, because oftentimes people don't want to give money to something that they won't actually see in their lifetime. And that can be a challenge, but it can be farmed, it can grow back. It just takes a long time. So they need a safe place to do so.
All right, so jellyfish or jellies are super popular online right now. There's lots of questions coming in about jellies. So a couple groups have asked about how big they can grow, and a couple groups have asked about what's the largest prey a really big jellyfish could tackle.
That's a cool question. The size of prey will depend on the jelly. They will sting everything. They don't have a brain, so they don't really know what they're doing. They will sting anything, and if it works, then they'll eat it, and they'll slowly digest it into their body. So the largest jelly that I'm aware of is a lion's mane jellyfish, and that was about the size of a mini or a small car. And the tentacles could also reach down the length of a football field. So that's the biggest size jelly that's ever been recorded, and the lion's mane jellyfish. So that could eat a large fish, essentially. Bigger jellies will eat bigger prey.
All right, very cool. So I think we can probably get a quick speed round in and hit each class one more time. Awesome. So let's give it a go. Let's start with Mrs. Huggs' group, because I see someone up at the camera.
How many species of fish how many species of jellyfish are known to so far?
Are known to what, sorry?
How many species of jellyfish are known so far?
I can't pick up that last word, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I think he's just curious about the number of species we've identified so far of jellyfish.
Okay. So that's a really good question. I actually don't know the answer to that one off the top of my head, but I can see if I can do a quick Google.
There's nothing wrong with checking Google because nobody knows everything, that's for sure.
And that's a good thing to remember. If your question involves a number, good chances that you can find that answer yourself. Just make sure you're using a good resource. So my quick search says about 2,000 different types of jellies, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and that's what came up for me too. And I think I would not be surprised if as we explore more, we find even more. That's a really cool thing about our oceans is there's so much left for us to explore and discover in the ocean.
Absolutely.
Okay, where do we need to go? Let's go Mrs. Rosendale's group. Your microphone is on. Did you ask what do they eat?
I asked how do they eat?
Oh, how do they eat? All right. So
How do they eat? So let me go back and pull up a picture again because there's two parts to a jelly. One is that they have those stinging tentacles that will help them catch their food. So usually paralyze the prey or at least stun them. But then they also have another part of their body called the oral arm, which is actually an extension of their stomach that's hanging off the body. So you can see that there are, sorry if it's a bit loud here, you can see that there are these flowery kind of bits that look kind of like cauliflower. That's part of their oral arm. So that actually helps to start the digestion process, and then they can absorb it into their stomach, which is pretty cool. So it's a 2-bit process. Most of the jellies will sting, and then they'll start dissolving the animal right away in those oral arms and bring it up into the stomach.
All right, very cool. Mr. Martel's class, microphone is on.
How much garbage goes into the coral reef every year?
That's an interesting question. We don't have a specific answer to it because the problem with garbage is that it never disappears. It just breaks down into smaller pieces. So because some of those pieces are too small for us to see without a microscope, we cannot count how many pieces of garbage there are. And because some people, unfortunately, will dump illegally, or because sometimes garbage isn't managed well and will end up in the ocean by accident, we don't know half the sources of garbage either. So it's estimated that about a dump truck of plastics per minute ends up in the ocean, and that's just plastics. That's not all the different types of garbage. So roughly a dump truck per minute, but it unfortunately might be worse than that.
All right, those are scary numbers. A dump truck a minute is a lot of plastic in our ocean.
Yeah, so that's why it's really good to cut it off at the source. So trying to prevent how much waste you use, reducing how much waste you put into the garbage, recycling, all those kind of stuff, then you're stopping it at its source, which is great.
All right, Mr. Warkoch's group, your microphone is on.
Coral will change its color.
Ooh, can coral change its color? That is a fantastic question. I don't know the answer to that. I've seen some corals be fluorescent, kind of like a highlighter. So it'll make them appear like they're different colors if it's dark out versus if it's light out. But in terms of actively changing their color, I don't know the answer to that. Please look it up and then tweet us and let us know if you find the answer.
All right, very cool. I took a quick look and what I saw was it's not usually a good thing if they're changing color drastically. Obviously, it's the bleaching that we talked about. So
okay, that makes sense.
Not a good sign.
That makes sense.
All right, I think we got one more class to visit. Where are they? There they are. Mrs. Bergeron's group.
Do animals try to hurt it?
The coral.
The coral.
Do animals hurt the coral? Some animals eat coral, so technically yes. Some specific types of fish are able to eat it despite the stinging. So they have predators as well, which is important to remember. And also too, sometimes big animals might sit on a coral. It happens. As long as it's not happening on a major scale, like when humans go swimming through and stomp on the coral, that's when we're worried. But it's natural for it to happen a little bit. So those are some fantastic questions. Do we have one more from YouTube or anything like that, or should I wrap up?
I can take a quick look at YouTube. While I'm looking, I really like that question about the fish eating, because when I scuba dive on coral reefs, I always hear crunch, 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 crunch of the parrotfish eating the coral. And then when they poop, it's sand. So those nice white sand beaches you see, oftentimes that sand is passed through a parrotfish, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. Most sand is dead animal bones and animal poop.
All right. Let's see. Well, jelly seems to be pretty popular right now. So Mrs. Pitt's class is wondering about dangerous jellyfish. I know there's definitely some in Australia. What are some of the dangerous jellyfish to humans?
Dangerous jellyfish. First one that comes to mind for me is always the box jelly. That's dangerous, and it's also dangerous because you can't see it very well because it's so translucent. If you're talking about cold water, then we have lion's mane jellyfish. You're not gonna die from it or anything like that, but it does hurt quite a bit. So that would be one that's, I would say, a predominant risk in colder waters. But most of the more dangerous ones live in tropical waters.
All right. Well, we have learned a lot about fish today, about jellies especially, and coral reef. So Rachel, thank you so much for taking some time to virtually take us to the aquarium, teach us a lot, and give us a pretty cool backdrop to do it in too.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining me today. I really encourage you, if you'd like to learn more, you can check out OceanWise's YouTube channel. There's lots of stories on there about corals, about other ecosystems, and also about the people that help to take care of it. Because ultimately, it might feel like a really big problem, but if every single one of us takes on one thing, you are going to make a huge difference. And that might be science. Maybe you become a researcher, but that could also be through storytelling or through art. Maybe you make a giant art sculpture depicting plastics. All of those things can be incredibly powerful. Here at the aquarium, we've got both scientists and artists, chefs, designers, mechanics, engineers, all of us working together to save the oceans. And you have a role to play in that too. So I hope you have fun figuring out what it is and exploring your natural environment, and stay curious and help the oceans.
All right, excellent. Last thing we'll do today is turn on the microphone. So boys and girls, nice and loud. Big goodbye and thank you for Rachel today. All right. I knew we could count on everybody for an awesome goodbye and thank you. Lots of fun today. Can't wait to see your classrooms again for another Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.